It's the first day of my new career. I'm a classical music host on public radio. And I'm in the library preparing for my first show, and that's when I run into one of my colleagues. I'm pulling discs, and he's putting discs away. And suddenly, we find ourselves kind of awkwardly in the exact same spot, right in front of a Beethoven recording with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. Now, rather than say to me, "Hey, welcome to the team," or "Sorry to box you in," he looks me right in the eye and he says, "I just learned why you're here, why you work here now." Okay, I say, not sure where this is going. And he just barrels on. "If what happened to you happened to me, I'd kill myself." Wow. Yeah, I mean, so direct. So honest, really from a stranger. He's got a point. What happened to me was kind of terrible. But to kill myself? I may not have felt it in the moment, but I smile, I reassure him, everything's going to be okay. You see, before that day, I wasn't a radio host. I was a professional musician, a classical flutist. I was one of the lucky few who made my living as a musician. And what a life it was. From the very first moment a flute was put in my hands and I made those tentative notes, music called to me. It reeled me right in, showing me that I could take static notes and breathe life into them for the ear, making melodies that would laugh or weep or just sing. And playing in an orchestra, up to the ante. Because suddenly I was around music, it was surrounding me, I was inside it, feeling it in my solar plexus. And there I was doing my part, creating music with others and speaking in our own special language. As a flutist, I had the opportunity to play in some iconic halls like Carnegie Hall, and with legendary conductors like Leonard Bernstein, and with some of the finest ensembles like the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, that recording I was reaching for that day in the library. Music was the voice of my soul. But let's face it, Beethoven and all of the other great composers, they were the creators. I was their master craftsman, amplifying their genius through my skill. And part of the reason I was successful is because I understood how physical music is. It's the physical manifestation of notes on the page. And consequently, my flute playing was also very physical. It was colorful and vibrant. So much so that the longtime music director of the Boston Symphony, Seiji Ozawa, he said I played with fantasy. It's such a poetic compliment. All those years of perfecting my skill meant that I no longer thought about how to make music and just allowed music to move through me. Until the day that music stopped moving through me. I first noticed something was wrong at a concert when for just a split second, I couldn't remember where to put my hands. Slowly and almost imperceptibly, my fingers seemed to disconnect from my brain as if they had a mind of their own. I thought I wasn't working hard enough, so I doubled down on practicing. I wasn't going to forget where to put my hands. Like all things in life, being a professional musician has a dark side. There's this saying that I don't really like very much. You're only as good as your last performance. That pressure puts a musician under increased risk for injury. Now, I thought that was what had happened to me. I'd injured myself. But as it turned out, I'd developed a neurological movement disorder called dystonia. Now, dystonia is horrible for musicians because it causes involuntary muscle contractions. You can't very well make music if your vocal cords won't vibrate, or your lips won't buzz, or your fingers won't work. It never occurred to me that my brain would betray me, that it would simply stop seeing my hands and they would refuse to move as I commanded them. But it did. Now, I'm one of those kind of people that feels We can overcome any obstacle with enough hard work. So I decided I'm going to beat dystonia into submission. I saw neurologists. I saw physical therapists. I had Botox injected directly into my hands. I had my flute completely rebuilt, and I did anything and everything to rewire my brain. But my facility and my ease of movement was simply gone. Turns out I couldn't beat dystonia into submission. My brain didn't care what I wanted it to do. Those 2 years of trying were the worst 2 years of my life. I had to step down from the orchestra and give up all of my flute playing work. I was devastated. So devastated I felt a life without being a professional musician would be empty, lacking meaning or purpose. After my flute career ended, I needed space, and I needed to move, at least the parts of my body that still worked. So I hit the trail. And a really funny thing happened out there on the trail. I noticed I was smiling and laughing a lot more, even when the going got tough. On the 2,600 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail from Canada to Mexico, other hikers called me blissful. I know, it's kind of an ironic name for someone who had all but given up hope. But it was right around this time that I learned about another blissful hiker, Beethoven. I know he wasn't exactly the long-distance blissful hiker I was fast becoming. But Beethoven tells us how happy he was when walking. He loved to walk. He needed his daily walks to clear his head and to capture the creative muse. And I was so taken with the story because Beethoven was exactly the same age as I was when he suffered his devastating loss. Beethoven was also at the height of his performing career. He was a pianist when he lost his hearing. And like me, he was crushed by it. And we know this because he wrote about it. He wrote a letter to his brothers, Carl and Johann, and it's filled with utter despair about what was happening to him. In this letter, he even contemplates killing himself. But the interesting thing is that he never sent the letter. He didn't need to. Once he let it all hang out, something changed in him. Beethoven went on living, stepping directly into what must have been a very unknown and dark future. You might say he hiked towards his bliss and went on to write some of the most astonishing music ever created. The thing about walking and hiking, it has a lot in common with the physical manifestation of music. I mean, think about it. Footsteps set a tempo. Ascending to a mountaintop is like soaring crescendos. Discoveries like a spring crocus poking through the snow or that pungent odor of balsam seem to have their own songs. Hiking got me back on track. And like Beethoven, I went on living too. I found another career at American Public Media where I became a cheerleader for those orchestras I could no longer play with. And I also started hiking more, a lot more, like thousands of miles more, and all by myself. At this time, I hiked long trails in the US, in Europe, South America, and Africa. I walked the entire length of New Zealand. I'm sure we can agree it got kind of obsessive. But walking all of those challenging trails didn't become a replacement of one high-achieving lifestyle for another. Instead, the trail became a setting for learning to live with my loss and moving forward into the unknown. No matter how much I prepare, until I actually place my feet on a trail, I never know what's going to happen. Everything's a surprise. I mean, not only in the views, but in the terrain, the weather, the people I'll run into, and maybe most importantly, how I'll respond in the moment. Anyone who's hiked can tell you it's not all wondrous beauty and transformative healing. I've definitely walked in less than blissful conditions. like nonstop rain, nonstop cold rain for days on end. I've lost all my toenails several times. I've had my gear infested with biting insects. And one time, I walked for a solid week on what turned out to be a broken foot. Yeah, dulling the pain with copious amounts of ibuprofen just to keep moving forward. And you know, if you hadn't noticed, or maybe you were just being polite, I'm, shall we say, a hiker of a certain age. I've had good days and bad days, days when I'm strong, and as I age, more days when I'm just fine taking the easier route. But here's what I've come to learn. The trail doesn't care what we want it to be. The trail is like life. It simply is what it is. Every day we're offered a choice, what I like to call a daily dose of do-overs. We get to decide how we deal with that reality. And that's its own kind of bliss-seeking, to search for solid ground in spite of life's inexplicable randomness. Developing dystonia in my fingers, as a professional musician who relied on the use of my fingers, is one of life's inexplicably random cruelties. But there's an interesting lesson there, because dystonia has no known cause. And what that means is that you can spend the rest of your life spinning your wheels and asking, why me? There's no answer to that question. Life isn't fair, and sometimes bad things just happen. Life offers sorrows, but bliss in equal measure. So if we want the wondrous and the transformative, if we want to be resilient, we have to ignore that question, why me, and keep putting our feet on the path. Now, I got to say, I feel a little bit sorry for that colleague of mine, back in the library. He summed up what happened to me as this horrible tragedy with no happy ending. I mean, true, every day I miss playing my flute like I used to. But if Beethoven could accept and embrace his terrible fate, so could I. Because if Beethoven hadn't, think about it, we wouldn't have the Ode to Joy, but neither would he. And we're not just survivors, we're thrivers. In a very different time, very different set of circumstances, Beethoven and I both found that we had something else important for us to do with our lives. Now, before I forget, I do want to share one thing. How I paid for my first long-distance through hike. I walked the entire length of New Zealand. Everybody wants to know the answer to this question. Obviously, I needed money, right? It just so happened I had something, I owned something of great value that was worth exactly the same amount that I needed to make this dream happen. My professional flute. I sold it to a very talented musician. She plays it every single day. I traded my flute for a hike. You might say, I traded my flute for my life. Thank you.